The conference room on the 23rd floor of the Harborfront Center smelled like fresh coffee and expensive cologne, and Isobel had been trying to ignore both since arriving an hour before the awards ceremony began. She was standing near the window reviewing her notes when Muriel texted to say they were downstairs. "We're in the lobby. Vi wants to come up and surprise you." Isobel smiled at her phone and wrote back, "Give me 5 minutes." She didn't make it. The elevator doors opened just as she reached the hallway, and Violet came running out with her arms stretched wide, wearing the yellow dress they'd bought together at the Kensington Market 2 Saturdays ago. She crashed into her mother's legs and held on tight. "Did you win?" Violet asked. "Not yet, the ceremony hasn't started." "You'll win," Violet said, with the complete certainty of a 6-year-old who has never once doubted her mother. "Grandma says so too." Muriel stepped off the elevator a few paces behind, carrying Violet's jacket and a look of quiet pride she never quite managed to hide. She opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. Isobel felt it before she understood it, the shift in the air, the way Muriel's expression changed. "Isobel." The voice came from behind her, low, careful, like someone choosing each word before setting it down. She turned around. Donovan was standing at the far end of the hallway in a dark charcoal suit, the top button of his dress shirt open. He looked slightly different from how she remembered, steadier, somehow, like the years had pressed something loose back into place. But his eyes were exactly the same. She would have recognized them anywhere. Which was exactly why she had been so afraid. Because Violet had those same eyes. Donovan wasn't looking at Isobel, he was looking at Violet. The little girl had gone quiet beside her mother, the way she always did around strangers, and she'd wrapped both arms around Isobel's leg without thinking. Donovan's gaze moved across the child's face slowly, her nose, the shape of her forehead, the particular way she tilted her head to one side when she was uncertain. And Isobel could see the exact moment the calculation happened behind his eyes. "Who is this?" he asked. Isobel placed her hand on Violet's shoulder. "My daughter." "How old is she?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Isobel didn't answer. The silence was its own answer, and they both knew it. Donovan looked up from Violet and met Isobel's eyes. "She has my grandfather's eyes," he said quietly. "The exact shape." "Donovan. Tell me she isn't mine." The hallway went still. Muriel drew Violet gently against her side, reaching down to press the child's face toward her coat. Isobel held Donovan's gaze. She had replayed this moment 100 times in the 6 years since she'd walked away from him. The version where she was calm, where she had the right words, where she didn't feel like the floor was dissolving under her feet. None of her rehearsed answers came. The silence said everything. She had met Donovan Whitmore 3 years before Violet was born, when she was 25 and still working as a junior associate at a landscape architecture firm in downtown Toronto. Whitmore Properties had commissioned a public green space design for a mixed-use development going up along the waterfront. Donovan arrived at the first site meeting 20 minutes late, without apology, scrolling through his phone while his assistant scrambled to set up the presentation materials behind him. He was good-looking and he knew it. That was the first thing Isobel noticed. The second thing she noticed was that he stopped scrolling when she began to speak. She was presenting the preliminary design concepts: native plantings, accessible pathways, a rain garden system that would manage stormwater runoff from the building above. She'd spent 2 weeks on it. She walked him through every decision with her annotated drawings spread across the boardroom table and didn't ask once whether it was what he'd been expecting. When she finished, Donovan looked at the drawings for a long time. "You didn't ask what I wanted," he said. "You hired us to tell you what the site needs. What you want is a separate conversation." The room went quiet. Donovan looked up at her, and for the first time since he'd walked in, he smiled. He texted her office number that evening. "That was the best site presentation I've sat through in 3 years. Dinner to discuss further?" She declined. He asked again differently, a few days later. She declined again. He sent nothing for 10 days and then showed up at her office building with 2 cups of tea from the shop around the corner, one green, one Earl Grey, and left them at reception with a note. Didn't know which. Figured one was right. The Earl Grey was right. She texted him to say so. He texted back, "So there's hope." She laughed. She hadn't meant to, but she did. Their first date was dinner near Trinity Bellwoods, and within 20 minutes, she told him plainly that she had no interest in a relationship, where she'd be expected to scale back her career for someone else's comfort. She'd watched her mother do it, watched her mother's ambitions disappear into someone else's idea of a proper household. And she'd promised herself she would never hand that part of herself over. Donovan listened. He said he understood. He almost did for a while. The problems started the way they always do. Small enough to dismiss, large enough to remember. A comment about how she dressed for client meetings. A question about why she'd had dinner with a colleague after an evening project review, asked in a tone that wasn't quite accusation but wasn't curiosity either. The time he called her firm's managing partner without telling her, suggesting her project load might be creating unnecessary stress, as if her ambition were a health problem to be managed. She confronted him every time. He apologized every time. Then he did it again slightly differently. The last argument came after he told his own parents she was coming to Thanksgiving at the family estate in Oakville. Without telling her, without asking, and she found out from Cordelia's assistant calling to confirm dietary preferences. "You signed me up for something without my consent," Isobel said. "That's not a misunderstanding. My family wants to meet you. That's a good thing. It's a good thing when you ask me first." Donovan sighed in the way that had started to make her chest tight. The sigh that meant he'd already decided she was being difficult. "You always do this. You treat every small thing like it's evidence of something." "Because it is." "Of what?" She looked at him. "That you never quite see me as someone whose answer matters." He didn't have anything to say to that. The silence stretched between them, and she realized they'd both been waiting. She for him to finally understand, he for her to eventually accept. Neither was going to happen. "I told you who I was from the beginning," she said. "I think you believed I'd change." She moved out of his apartment 2 weeks later. She found out she was pregnant 6 weeks after that. She was reviewing construction drawings in her kitchen when the nausea hit. She'd had a stomach thing for 3 days and kept telling herself it was the smoked meat sandwich she'd had at lunch. By the 4th day, she stopped believing it. The test sat on her bathroom counter for a long time before she looked at it. When she finally did, her first thought wasn't Donovan. Her first thought was the competition submission deadline in 11 weeks. A national parks design competition she'd been working toward for 8 months. She did the math. She could still finish it. Then she sat down on the edge of the bathtub and cried for reasons she couldn't fully name. Her family doctor confirmed the pregnancy and mentioned gently that Isobel had a uterine irregularity that could make future pregnancies difficult. This one would need monitoring. If anything were to happen, conceiving again might be complicated. Isobel drove home and sat in her parked car for 40 minutes before going inside. 3 days later, she decided to keep the baby. Not because she wanted Donovan back, not because she thought a child would fix what was broken between them. She decided because it was hers to decide, and no one else's. But the baby had a father. He had the right to know. She met him at the cafe on Queen West where they'd gone on their 3rd date. She put the lab results on the table between them. The smile that had been on his face when he sat down disappeared. He looked at the paper for a long time without speaking. When he finally did, the first question wasn't "How are you?" or "Are you all right?" It was, "Is it mine?" Isobel said nothing. He realized what he'd asked. He corrected himself, reached for her hand. She moved it. He asked how far along. He said everything had happened so fast. He said he wasn't sure he was ready for this. He said they'd just broken up. Every sentence made complete sense, and every one of them landed like a small, careful door closing. She picked up her bag. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Raise the baby," she said, "by myself if I have to." She left. He called 14 times that night. 2 weeks later, Cordelia Whitmore sent a message asking to meet. Cordelia was already seated when Isobel arrived at the cafe near her office, stirring a cortado she hadn't touched. She was one of those women who wore composed like a second skin, everything neutral, everything expensive, nothing careless. "I appreciate you coming," she said. "You knew I'd be curious." Cordelia smiled. "You're a smart woman, Donovan always said so." Isobel wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "What do you want?" "What's best for everyone?" Cordelia set down her spoon. "You've worked hard to build your career. You're doing something real with your life. A child under these circumstances, unplanned, no support structure, a broken relationship, would complicate that considerably. That's my problem to manage. It doesn't have to be." Cordelia's voice stayed perfectly even. We can help you start over. A different city, if you'd prefer. Financial support while you reestablish yourself. We're not asking you to disappear, we're offering you an easier path. Isobel looked at her, and the baby? Raised by its family, with everything a child needs. Good schools, stability, the Whitmore name. And the baby's mother? Cordelia didn't answer that part. If I say no, Isobel said. Cordelia's expression didn't change. You're a young woman with a career that depends on professional reputation. A complicated personal situation, played out publicly, the kind of thing people talk about in this city, could affect that reputation in ways that take years to recover from. She paused. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you what I know to be true. Isobel stood up. Think carefully, Cordelia said. Don't let pride cost you everything. Isobel walked for 2 hours after that meeting. Then she called her mother, Muriel, from a bench in Riverdale Park and said simply, I need to talk. Muriel came. She always came. She sat on the bench and listened to everything without interrupting. The pregnancy, Cordelia's offer, what Isobel had decided, and when Isobel finished, Muriel was quiet for a long time. Then, and Donovan? He doesn't know I'm still pregnant. Muriel turned to look at her daughter. What did you tell him? Isobel looked at the park, at the lake flat in the distance, that I'd lost it. Her mother didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then, and you're sure? I'm sure. If I tell him the truth, his mother will have every reason to start the fight she already wants to have. And Donovan will ask me to compromise. He'll ask me to give something up so everyone else can have peace. He'll mean well, and I'll lose anyway. Muriel reached over and held her daughter's hand. Neither of them spoke. From that evening on, Muriel moved into Isobel's spare room. Violet was born in late October, 4 days earlier than expected, in a delivery that required more intervention than anyone had planned for. Isobel had been terrified in the specific, cold way that leaves no room for anything else. Muriel held her hand and told her repeatedly that everything was going to be fine. And Isobel believed her, the way she always believed her mother. Not because she knew it to be true, but because Muriel said it with absolute certainty, and certainty is its own kind of medicine. When the nurse placed Violet on her chest, Isobel looked at her daughter's face for the first time and felt something rearrange itself deep in her chest. Some fundamental thing, like a compass needle finding north. Hello, Vi, she said. Violet grew. Isobel worked, first from home, then back at the firm part-time, then full-time again. Muriel managed the mornings, Isobel managed the evenings. The days were long and the nights were longer. And sometimes at 2 in the morning when Violet was sick, or teething, or simply refusing to sleep, Isobel would stand in the dim kitchen with a baby on her hip and feel the exhaustion so completely that she could barely remember why she'd made the choices she'd made. Then Violet would look up at her with those eyes, his eyes, but hers now, completely hers, and Isobel would rock her and hum something tuneless and think, this is enough, this is exactly enough. When Violet was 3, she asked about her father. Isobel had prepared for this. She'd rehearsed careful answers. When the actual question came, quiet, matter of fact, delivered over cereal one Tuesday morning, none of the rehearsed answers felt right. Your dad lives somewhere else, Isobel said. Does he know about me? Isobel looked at her daughter's face. No, sweetheart. Why not? Because I made a complicated choice when you were very little. And one day I'll explain it better. Violet considered this with the particular gravity of 3-year-olds, then went back to her cereal. She didn't ask again for a long time. When she did, she was 4 and her question was simply, is Dad nice? Isobel thought about it honestly. He can be, she said. Back in the harborfront hallway, the silence between them had gone on long enough. You have a daughter, Donovan said. He said it slowly, like he was testing the weight of each word. Yes. She's mine. Yes. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth and looked away. When he turned back, his expression had shifted, not anger yet, not fully, but something underneath it beginning to move. You told me you'd lost the baby. I know. I stood in your apartment. You looked at me and you said, I know what I said. For 6 years I thought there was nothing. I know. Don't just keep saying that. He stepped back. Don't stand there and say I know like you're waiting for me to stop being upset. She didn't answer. After a moment he said quietly, why? She looked at him. Your mother came to see me, before I'd told anyone, before I'd decided anything. She sat across from me in a cafe and told me that if I kept the baby, There would be ways to make my professional life very difficult. She offered me money to step aside and let your family raise the child without me. Donovan went very still. I didn't tell you, Isobel said, because I knew that if I did, you would go home and confront her, and she would deny it or minimize it, and then you would come back and ask me to see her side. And I wasn't willing to gamble my child's safety on the possibility that you might, this one time, hold your ground. The silence between them stretched. My mother, he said finally, came to you. Yes. He turned and stood looking at the window for a long time. The city sat below them, gray in late September, the lake flat in the distance. I would have held my ground, he said. Isobel said nothing. He turned back. You should have given me the chance. Maybe, she said. And maybe I was wrong. I've had 6 years to think about it, and I still don't know what I would do differently. She met his eyes. But I'm not going to apologize for keeping her safe. It took 3 weeks and 2 very difficult conversations before Donovan met Violet. He'd called Isobel the day after the awards ceremony, then again 2 days later, and the third time she answered. They met at a coffee shop on a Thursday afternoon, just the two of them, without lawyers. He said he wanted to be in Violet's life. He said it plainly, without performance, which surprised her. She said she wasn't going to fight that. She just needed it done carefully, for Violet's sake. They agreed on a first meeting, a Saturday morning at the Science Center, where Violet had a standing obsession with the weather exhibit. Donovan arrived early. He stood by the entrance with his hands in his coat pockets, looking like he'd rehearsed something and then forgotten all of it. Violet walked up to him with the focused assessment of a child who has been told something significant and is processing it in real time. She looked at his face. She looked at her mother. She looked back at him. Mom says you're my dad, she said. He crouched down to her level. That's right. How come I haven't met you before? He glanced up at Isobel briefly. That's a long story. I'll tell you when you're bigger. Violet seemed to accept this. She studied him for another moment. Do you know anything about weather? A bit. The weather exhibit is this way, she said, and turned and walked in without waiting to see if he followed. He followed. For 8 weeks they found a rhythm, careful, supervised, built in small increments. Isobel stayed nearby. Donovan showed up when he said he would and he left when the time was up. Violet began to warm. The first time she called him Dad, accidentally, mid-sentence, reaching up to show him something on a museum display. Donovan stopped walking and stood very still for a moment. Isobel watched from across the room. His eyes had gone red at the corners. He didn't mention it. He just followed Violet to the next display. The trouble came on a Sunday in early December. Donovan had taken Violet out for the afternoon, the first time Isobel had agreed to a visit without being present. She'd saved every message. She knew his address. She'd set up a tracking feature on Violet's smartwatch. She'd gone over the rules twice. Be home by 5, no driving outside the agreed area, no visits to the Whitmore estate in Oakville. Donovan agreed to all of it. At 4:15, Violet's location pin moved onto the lakeshore heading west, away from the city. Isobel called. He answered on the third ring. Where are you? A pause. I'm taking a short detour. Donovan. She kept her voice flat. Where is my daughter? My parents want to meet her, just for an hour. It's fine. Her hand went cold. You promised. My father was insistent. It's one visit, Isobel. They're her grandparents. That visit was supposed to happen when we agreed on it together. Bring her back. We'll be home by 6. I said, bring her back. He hung up. She was in her car before she'd consciously decided to move. The Whitmore estate had always felt designed to remind you how much smaller you were than the people who owned it. Stone pillars, iron gates, a driveway long enough to make walking feel like a punishment. Isobel pulled up to the gate at 5:20 and pressed the intercom. No answer. She pressed it again. A woman's voice, one of the household staff, told her that Mr. Whitmore was unavailable. I'm here for my daughter, Isobel said. Open the gate. I'm sorry, ma'am. I have instructions not to. Isobel pressed the button again and held it. Donovan answered eventually, through the intercom. His voice was tense. She's fine. She's inside. She's coming home. 1 more hour. Donovan, if you don't open this gate. She's perfectly safe. The intercom cut out. Isobel took out her phone and called her solicitor. It was a Sunday evening, but her solicitor answered. She explained the situation in 3 sentences. Pickup time missed. Child taken to an address she'd explicitly forbidden, gate access denied. She stood outside those iron bars for nearly 40 minutes. She could see lights in the upper windows. She pressed the intercom again and again. At one point she thought she heard Violet's voice, small and far away, and every muscle in her body went rigid. Then, the gate clicked. It swung open slowly. Isobel didn't wait for it to finish moving. She was through and up the front steps before anyone appeared in the doorway. She found Violet in the sitting room, small and upright in a large chair that dwarfed her, both hands in her lap, her jacket still on, as though she'd decided she wasn't staying and wanted her body to remember it. She hadn't eaten any of the food on the low table beside her. When she heard her mother's footsteps, she turned and said, simply, "Mum," and her voice came out wrecked in the way that told Isobel she'd been holding it together for a while and had just now stopped. Isobel crossed the room and gathered her daughter into her arms. "I tried to call you on my watch," Violet said quietly against her shoulder. "The signal didn't work inside." "I know, sweetheart. Mum's here now." Cordelia was standing near the fireplace. She said nothing. Alistair stood behind her with the particular expression of a man who'd gotten what he wanted, without quite finishing the thought about what came next. Donovan had followed Isobel inside. He stood in the doorway, and when he looked at his daughter's face, pressed into her mother's coat, small hands clutching the lapels, something shifted in him. Isobel saw it happen. The thing he'd told himself was justified rearranging itself into what it actually was. "I'm taking her home," Isobel said. She didn't raise her voice. Cordelia spoke. "You can't blame us for wanting to meet our granddaughter." "What I'm taking her home from," Isobel said, "is the feeling of sitting in a stranger's house with her jacket on, waiting for someone to come." She looked at Donovan. "He promised me. I trusted him." Donovan looked at the floor. Isobel picked Violet up and walked out without another word. He called 2 days later. She didn't answer. He sent a message. "I was wrong. I'm sorry. That wasn't what I said I'd do and I did it anyway. I have no excuse." She read it and didn't respond for 4 days. When she did, she wrote, "Violet had bad dreams for a week. She's scared of gates now." He didn't reply to that. There was nothing to say. A month later, they met with a mediator at a family law center on St. Clair. No courtroom, no judge. An encouraged attempt to reach a parenting agreement without litigation. Donovan came without his parents. Isobel brought Muriel. A child specialist had spoken with Violet privately before the session. When Violet came in to sit with Isobel for the last part of the meeting, she held her mother's hand and looked across the table at Donovan, with the careful, undefended honesty that children have before they learn to hide things. The mediator asked her, "Violet, do you want to spend time with your dad?" "Yes." "Would you like to sleep over at your dad's house someday?" Violet shook her head immediately. "Can you tell me why?" Violet looked at her lap. "Because the last house had a big gate and Mum couldn't get in." The room was very quiet. Donovan's jaw moved. He looked at the table. The mediator said gently, "And if it were a different house? A house without a gate?" Violet considered. "Would Mum know where it was?" "Yes." "Would Mum be able to come if I called?" "Yes." Violet looked sideways at Isobel, then at Donovan. "Okay," she said, "but not yet." Donovan nodded slowly. He had the look of a man being asked to earn something he'd assumed was simply his, and only now understanding the difference. Isobel spoke at the end of the session. She said she had never intended to cut Donovan out of Violet's life permanently. She said she had been wrong to lie to him, and she knew it, and she wasn't asking for that to be overlooked. She said what she was asking for was a parenting arrangement built around Violet's sense of safety, not around what either of her parents felt they were owed. Donovan said he agreed. Cordelia and Alistair were not in the building. That had been Donovan's condition for attending. Isobel had noted it without comment. In January, Donovan took Violet to the Royal Ontario Museum's afternoon family program, just the two of them on a Saturday. He sent a photo at noon, Violet standing beside a dinosaur skeleton, arms stretched wide, grinning with every tooth she had. Isobel looked at the photo for a long time before putting her phone down. He brought Violet home at 4:30. Violet ran up the building stairs ahead of him and buzzed herself in without looking back. Donovan stood on the front step. "She told me a joke on the subway," he said, "about a penguin." "Was it funny?" "It didn't make any sense," he said. "But she laughed so hard she nearly fell off the seat." He looked at the door Violet had disappeared through. "She's extraordinary." "She is," Isobel said. "You did that." She looked at him. I had help. He nodded. He seemed like he wanted to say something else, and then decided against it. Same time next week? Same time next week, she said. He walked back toward the street. At the corner, without turning around, he raised one hand briefly. Not quite a wave. Something quieter than that. Isobel stood on the step until he rounded the corner. Then she went inside, climbed the stairs, and found Violet already in her room, pulling her boots off, and telling Muriel about the penguin joke in the loud, breathless way she told all her best stories. The punchline didn't make any sense. Muriel laughed anyway. Isobel leaned against the doorframe and listened, and thought that sometimes a family wasn't the thing you'd planned. Sometimes it was the thing that stayed, steady and ordinary, at the end of every day. The boots dropped in the hallway, the kettle already on, the small voice explaining something that didn't quite add up, and the two of them listening like it was the most important thing they'd heard all week. Because it was.